Welcome everyone. So we're delighted to see a full house and thrilled to have Chairman Atkins with us this afternoon. Just want to take a few minutes. My name is Bobby Bartlett. I am a co-director of the Rock Center along with Colleen Honigsberg, my colleague at Stanford. We're both also on the law faculty. I wanted to just say a few words to start us off. We're just incredibly honored to host Chairman Atkins, who, as you know, is the 34th chair of the SEC. And I want to thank Ken King for his assistance in Skadden and co-sponsoring today's program, as well as the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, or SEPR. It's fitting that on this occasion, focused on the future of capital formation, innovation, and governance, that we're also pleased to make a really exciting announcement at Stanford regarding the launch of a new initiative at the Rock Center based on private capital. As private capital continues to play a larger role in financing companies and shaping markets, this initiative will explore the evolving legal, governance, and policy questions surrounding private capital, including how private capital-backed companies and funds seek liquidity and interact with the public capital markets. We're also extremely pleased to announce that Scott James, Scott, are you here? Scott, I saw you earlier. There's Scott, who is with us today, will be joining Stanford Law School and the Rock Center to help lead this effort. Scott most recently served as partner and COO at Goodwater Capital and previously served as an executive at DCVC and Excel, and is a longtime friend of the law school. He brings deep experience across venture capital, startup law, and private markets, particularly at the intersection of private capital formation, innovation, and company growth. And we're just thrilled to have him join the Stanford community as we launch the new initiative. Following the chairman's opening remarks and fireside conversation, we will continue with a panel discussion featuring Rulav Bota of Sequoia Capital, Cynthia Gaylor of OpenAI, and Phil Kirk of Databricks, moderated by Thomas Ivey of Skadden. We're incredibly grateful to all of them for joining us today. And now it is my privilege to introduce Chairman Paul Atkins. Chairman Atkins has spent decades at the center of securities regulation, corporate governance, and capital markets policy. Throughout his career, he has been a thoughtful voice on promoting capital formation, protecting investors, and ensuring that American markets remain dynamic and competitive. We are honored to welcome him to Stanford. Please join me in welcoming Chairman Paul Atkins.
Thanks, Bobby. Oh, yeah. Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Bobby. And sorry I was detained a bit here. I'm sorry to be late, but and it's really a pleasure to be with you all today. Of course, I should also like to extend my thanks to Stanford Rock Center for Corporate Governance for the opportunity to discuss our ongoing work at the SEC, work that I know touches the professional lives of many of you all here in this room. To the business leaders and market participants who've joined us, thank you very much. I'm grateful for your presence, and I trust that the reflections that I hope to share today will prove both perhaps insightful for you and meaningful for your work. But before I do, I have to note the customary disclaimer that the views I express here are my own as chairman and not necessarily those of the SEC as an institution or of my fellow commissioners. Well, over the past year, we've moved decisively on our agenda at the SEC to return to the first principles across every dimension of the SEC's mandate, namely to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. Fundamental to fulfilling this mandate, especially to protect investors and promote capital formation, is expanding the number of publicly listed companies. Accordingly, one of the most ambitious aspects of my policy agenda as chairman is to incentivize more companies to go public and to stay public, or as I've often put it, to make IPOs great again. So vibrant public and private markets can and should coexist. They are not mutually exclusive. However, the strength of the U.S. public markets over the past 90 years has primarily powered the innovation of our entrepreneurs, the prosperity of our workers, and the economic growth of our nation. Public markets function as the anchor of American capital formation because they forge liquidity, transparency, price discovery, and accountability in a way that private markets cannot fully replicate. So as a result, public markets also provide meaningful investment opportunity for millions of Americans. More than a corporate milestone, every IPO is an invitation for workers and savers to share in the prosperity of the next generation of American enterprise. When more companies become public, especially earlier in their life cycle, all investors, not just a select few with access to the private markets, can participate in and benefit from the growth in their value. Shortly after I left the SEC as a staff member back in the mid-1990s, more than 7,800 companies were listed on the U.S. securities exchanges. When I returned as chairman a year ago, that number had fallen by roughly 40%. Today, companies tend not to go public, if at all, until after their Series D or E rounds of private financing, whereas 30 years ago, an IPO would be the equivalent of today's Series B or C. So revitalizing our public markets means dismantling the barriers that drove companies away in the first place. Overly burdensome SEC rules may not be the sole reason for this decline, but where regulatory frictions are a determinant of it, the agency is moving right now intently to remove them. In the time that we have together, I'll first share that what we have achieved thus far to that end before turning to what we still plan to accomplish in the next 2.5+ years. Some of you may recall that last September, the Commission issued a policy statement regarding companies' inclusion of mandatory arbitration provisions in their governing documents. These provisions require shareholders to arbitrate their claims against the company that arise under the federal securities laws. Prior to that statement, the SEC staff, with the apparent support of agency leadership, told companies on an ad hoc basis that including such a provision would prevent their registered offering from proceeding or substantially delay it. Well, those days of unwritten, consequential policies are over. Our formal Commission policy statement reversed this shadow position and clarified that, based on Supreme Court precedent, mandatory arbitration provisions are not inconsistent with the federal securities laws. This decision reaffirms that the SEC is not a merit regulator and must operate within its mandate as a disclosure agency, including with respect to a company's chosen method of resolving disputes with its shareholders. In that same spirit, the Commission earlier this month proposed amendments that, if adopted, would provide public companies with the option of filing one semi-annual report each year in lieu of 3 quarterly reports. Removing the SEC's thumb from the scale, as we proposed, affords companies regulatory flexibility based on their industry, business model, and investor expectations. Just last week, the Commission issued 2 additional proposals that, if adopted, would build upon legislative and regulatory concepts that have proven successful in the past and which aim to extend that success to more companies in the future, particularly small and mid-sized companies, creating further incentive to go and, more importantly, stay public. The first, referred to as registered offering reform, would expand access to the SEC's so-called shelf registration process, which allows public companies to access public markets quickly and when market conditions are most favorable. Currently, due to eligibility restrictions, newly public companies cannot use shelf registration, and smaller companies have only limited access to shelf registration. Registered offering reform, meanwhile, would expand the full availability of shelf registration to nearly all public companies, including the newest and the smallest, increasing the number of eligible companies by 60%. Additionally, this proposal would extend certain offering and communication flexibilities currently reserved only for the largest companies that have been public for at least 1 year to all companies listed on a U.S. Securities Exchange. This change alone would represent a 200% increase in companies receiving these flexibilities. The second reform that we proposed last week, referred to as filer status reform, would recalibrate disclosure requirements based on a company's size and how long it's been public. As a result, more companies would receive relief from some of the most onerous SEC requirements, including the obligation to obtain an auditor attestation of internal control over financial reporting. Currently, that benefit is reserved for newly public and smaller companies. Filer status reform would broaden it to approximately 81% of public companies, including certain seasoned and mid-sized issuers. The proposal would also build on the so-called IPO on-ramp concept that Congress created by extending the length of time that companies can potentially remain on the on-ramp and be exempt from auditor attestation, that auditor attestation requirement, and others like it. So taken together, these actions reflect the SEC's significant progress since I became chairman to incentivize more companies to go and stay public, and in doing so, to revitalize our capital markets. But the work is far from finished, and additional noteworthy initiatives are on the horizon. The Commission staff is well underway in developing recommendations for proposed changes to rationalize, simplify, and modernize the SEC's public company disclosure requirements, including with respect to executive compensation. Guided by materiality as our North Star, I would like to see the Commission's disclosure regime reflect the minimum effective dose of regulation necessary to elicit information that's material to a reasonable investor without requiring information that is indisputably immaterial. So, of course, the incentives for going public are only as effective as the process that companies must navigate to capitalize on them. With that in mind, I've asked the Commission staff to prepare recommendations to modernize the IPO process itself. I routinely hear from companies and their advisors that one of the challenges of the IPO process is navigating the communication or so-called gun-jumping rules under the Securities Act of 1933. In light of this, I'd like to see any rulemaking in this area include considerable reforms to these rules. When Congress originally enacted the Securities Act in 1933, a company could not make any oral or written offers to sell securities before a registration statement became effective. But as Linda Quinn, a former director of the SEC's Division of Corporation Finance, once questioned, do we really need to continue to register offers? So over time, both Congress and the Commission eased the prohibition on offers. However, the Commission's spider web of gun-jumping prohibitions and exceptions remains very difficult to maneuver. Moreover, the last time that the Commission implemented significant reform in this area was more than 20 years ago. The ways in which businesses communicated with employees, customers, and potential investors at that time bears little resemblance to how they do so now. As the Commission staff prepares its recommendations, I look forward to constructing a more harmonized set of rules that offer clarity, simplicity, and congruity with today's technology. Modernizing the IPO process also invites a broader reassessment of the method by which companies become public. IPOs conducted through a firm commitment underwriting offer many benefits and have been and likely will remain the dominant path for companies intending to go public, but they are by no means the only one. For example, in recent years, combining with a special purpose acquisition company or SPAC has become a popular workaround to the process of becoming a public company. But instead of standing idly by while companies pursue indirect paths to going public, regulators and market participants should move decisively to remedy the root causes and remove the barriers to more direct approaches. For the public market debut of companies offering the next generation of products and services, the traditional IPO process may, in some respects, still be stuck in the prior generation. So I call on founders, executives, investors, bankers, lawyers, and others to boldly innovate and remain open to alternative methods of taking a company public. Now, an alternative method may not be ideal for every company, but for some, it may offer faster and cheaper execution, less susceptibility to unfavorable market conditions, and greater valuation certainty. And if the market does develop an alternative method, the SEC and other regulators should not introduce or maintain regulatory frictions that stand in the way. So consider, for example, becoming a public company through a direct listing, the path that Spotify took back in 2018. In anticipation of that listing on the New York Stock Exchange, the NYSE proposed amendments to its listing standards that would have required only an Exchange Act, a 34 Act registration statement, without a concurrent Securities Act registration statement. However, the NYSE ultimately withdrew this aspect of the proposal, and the listing standards that the Commission approved retained the Securities Act registration requirement. NASDAQ standards for direct listings similarly require a Securities Act registration statement. Initial registration statements filed under the Exchange Act and the Securities Act contain largely the very same company disclosure and generally undergo the same Commission staff review process. However, a Securities Act registration statement subjects the company and any person deemed to be an underwriter to more stringent liability standards for material misstatements or omissions under Section 11 of the 33 Act. Yet following a unanimous 2023 Supreme Court decision, investors who purchase shares following a direct listing may find it difficult to establish a claim pursuant to Section 11, though recourse through other liability provisions under the federal securities laws remains possible. As we look for ways to improve the process and the method of becoming a public company, regulators and market participants might consider revisiting how direct listings are conducted and the associated legal requirements. As part of this consideration, it behooves us to ask questions such as, following that 2023 Supreme Court decision, does the market really believe that a Securities Act registration statement continues to offer meaningful investor protections in the direct listing context? Is the requirement to prepare a Securities Act registration statement as opposed to an Exchange Act one a hindrance for companies contemplating a direct listing? And beyond the form of the registration statement, are there other regulatory frictions in the direct listing process that the Commission or its staff can reduce through rulemaking or guidance, respectively, while preserving investor protections? So these are the types of questions that I hope today's conversation will inspire you all to answer. But I'm equally eager to hear your broader ideas for modernizing IPOs overall, whether that means improving the SEC's communication or other IPO-related rules, or identifying ways that the agency can remove roadblocks to non-traditional paths to going public. Beginning today, the SEC will accept written comments, and I encourage you all to submit yours by the 27th of July, though of course we'll still consider comments received after that date. All the ideas are most welcome, and I have just one request, that you be bold and that you be creative. And as you share your ideas, you have my word that we are listening. So with that, thank you for your time and attention today. And Mr. Robinson, I now look forward to our discussion. So thank you all very much. Yep. Steady, steady. All right.
I should begin. I'm Peter Robinson. I'm at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Paul and I have known each other since he was Chairman Breeden's Chief of Staff, and I had the best acronym in the federal government. I was the director of something called the SEC Office of Public Affairs and Policy Evaluation, which comes down to O, paper.
Right.
I never really liked him much then, and I'm just doing this as a favor to my wife, who's friends with his wife, and you get the picture.
Yeah, right. But that was back in the old days when paper ruled, and now it doesn't.
Yes, exactly.
So.
All right, Paul, you mentioned this a moment ago, and in fact, it was the centerpiece of your speech. But let me go back to the basic figures here. In the last 30 years, the number of public companies has declined from about 8,000 to about 5,000. Today, over 85% of companies with revenues of 100 million or more are private, not public, and since 1980, the average age of companies choosing to go public has doubled. There was a piece in the Journal just last week on the coming IPO of SpaceX, cheering the return of IPOs. But even at that, SpaceX is now 11 years old. And in the old days, it would have gone public much more quickly. So who cares? What difference does it make if we're getting fewer and fewer IPOs? What difference does it make to markets? What difference does it make to the good of the country?
Well, I think one thing that I like to emphasize is that the United States was an investment before it was a nation. And that is because in Great Britain and in France and in the Netherlands, they stood up public companies that received a royal charter for land or whatever, and then, but that paid for the rickety wooden boats to sail across the Atlantic. If the people survived, then they had to scratch, to try to put a livelihood together and survive. So, that imbues the real ethos of the United States, I think, and our willingness to take risks and to invest for the future. And we, in that mode, are the envy of the world, basically. Everywhere I go, Japan, the UK, and everywhere in the EU, the question I get from, the officials there is, how can we replicate what you have in the United States, your capital markets? So they have their capital markets project in the EU, and Japan is now, trying to get people to put money into, for long-term retirement schemes and things like that, which is good news for American investment banks and other asset managers to go over there and sell their products, both there and in Europe. But, it's hard going because of the ethos. It's the proverbial, like, Belgian dentist who would buy a bond and then stick it under his mattress, or the Japanese who just put money into savings accounts, and the same with the Frenchmen and whatnot. So all of that is how, I just basically tell them, you can't, I don't think you can do it top down. You have to, it's really a bottom up type of program, but they have to put the incentives in. So for us here in the United States, the public markets have really powered our growth of, all that we enjoy here with respect to our livelihood and the lights and buildings and everything else. The early Europeans invested in canals and in railroads, and that triggered the auditing profession, where flinty-eyed Scotsmen came over with their green-eyed shades to check out, to see what happened to the money that investors put in to build a railroad or whatever, and chase down the fraudsters who were inevitably there, and then with Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell and the stringing together of the the electrical grid as we know it, it was all private capital for the most part that really built those, and so that's why it's important. And I think that to view this as an opportunity to democratize our capital markets is important, because for people to have a stake in the country is really important, and that's why Trump accounts, I think, are an amazing idea, and how that's being built out by even private donors to even broaden them, shows that the idea has a lot of currency and pickup now. So all of that is just, I think, vitally important.
So Warren Buffett and Jamie Dimon in the Wall Street Journal, this is a few years ago. Short-term oriented capital markets have discouraged companies with a longer-term view from going public at all. Here they raise the prospect that it's the markets themselves, it's demands from the markets that discourage companies from going public. So the question, do you have some feel for the proportion? There must be a tighter way of putting this, but I'll just put it the sloppy way that occurs to me. If we're down from 8,000 to 5,000 companies, public companies, how much of that decline is because the SEC overreached the burdensome disclosure requirements, the non-material disclosure requirements, the arbitrariness that we felt during the Gary Gensler regime at the SEC, and how much of it is, to put it in a negative way, because markets demand results, public markets demand results quarter to quarter, or to put it in a positive way, because technology has permitted the pooling of private capital much more efficiently, at a much lower cost. In other words, if you get everything right at the SEC, will you make IPOs great again?
Well, I hope so, and that's why I'm thrilled to be here in Silicon Valley, in the heart of it, and I'm hoping that you all have some great ideas. But certainly, if you look back on the last 40-some years, when I started out as a young lawyer in New York in the mid-'80s, doing IPOs and flying out here to San Francisco and Seattle and Portland and whatnot to do, especially technology offerings. Back then, $17 million IPO was really great, and people were really thrilled, and so that was companies had to go to the public markets to raise capital. And Andreessen Horowitz has a presentation I really like. It's a bar chart, basically, and it compares the total return for insiders, meaning not just employees but also venture capitalists and private equity investors in the early days. So say Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, AMD or whatever. So it's a tiny sliver of the insiders, viewed largely, but most of the return of the company, to shareholders, went to the public markets, to those who invested in the IPO and later on, versus now where there are much more established companies, and like SpaceX is who knows how much that's going to be, but that's going to be a huge amount, obviously. But nowadays it's just a sliver at the top of the public investors as compared to all the others. And so that's a real change as to how the markets themselves have been. And to your point is, you have a declining number of individuals in the population through death, of course, and so bankruptcy, and then mergers and acquisitions takes companies out of the reservoir there. And so unless you have newbies coming in, obviously it declines over time. So the real question is, well, why are they not going? And part of it is, yes, there's been, in the 80s, the SEC adopted changes to 144A and adopted that reg, which made it easier for institutions to buy and sell, private companies. And then Congress in the 90s allowed hedge funds to really come about and blow past the 100 shareholder limit to that, if they're all, of a certain size and a category. So that turbocharged it. Then you had sovereign wealth funds and family offices and whatnot from the great creation of wealth that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years. And then you also mentioned communications revolution, which also turbocharged the creation of wealth, just like we're seeing perhaps now with AI. I'm sure that'll probably be sustainable and all of that. So we have all these very major innovations technologically that have been made possible through, again, investment of capital and people taking risks. So as to whether that's done in the private markets or in the public markets, luckily we have the private markets. I mean, we would be sucking wind as an economy if we didn't have them, especially private credit, because of, after the financial crisis, the Congress got its way where it kind of chased the big banks out of lending to small and medium-sized enterprises. And were it not for private credit to step in, our economy would not be in the shape it is nowadays. So anyway, all these things come together, but what I'm looking to do is to try to reduce those frictions to, like, if somebody is there are a lot of benefits to go public. It's a currency for M&A. It's, helping provide liquidity for investors. Now there are alternatives in the private markets as well for the latter of those two. But still, there is a lot to be said about being a public company, the freedom it gives in many ways. But if we can deal with, the costs, through a disclosure that's not material and just the apparatus to support it, the litigation issues that I diverted to here, and then also the weaponization of corporate governance, and then other things. I hear over and over again, the problem with the IPO process is the uncertainty about exactly when you can go to market, when you can hit the sweet spot, which is why people drifted to SPACs and other things, and SPACs are a workaround. So, if we can get back to a process that works for companies to raise capital, then I can't see, a downside to that. And it would be, again, better for, I think, just to have an alternative overall for liquidity and valuation and all that.
This brings us to crypto. And before addressing a question to Paul, I would like to ask Tim Draper to stand, turn around, and show everyone his tie.
No, yeah.
I highly recommend that you have some Bitcoin in your wallet, just in case Silicon Valley Bank goes up.
Yeah. I forgot to wear my...
Cover your family or 2 weeks of payroll.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim.
That's right. I forgot to wear my orange tie. So anyway.
Paul Atkins, speaking earlier this year at the University of Texas, you said that the way the SEC used to regulate cryptocurrency represented, here I'm quoting you, a big missed opportunity for the United States. Why?
Well, basically, by not addressing the issue of uncertainty over what a cryptocurrency is, and by basically treating it as a security, which I think was misplaced, that basically made it impossible for lawyers to give opinions to people as to what whether they should register, and then if you should register, how would you do it? Because despite the protestations of the SEC, like, oh, it's easy to do. We have this simple form online. You just fill it out, come in and talk to us. Well, that was disingenuous. The form called an S1 is completely inapposite to, a token. And there was no attempt to try to adapt it to a changing environment. It was like our way or the highway, and so people took the highway. Basically, they went abroad, and to try to innovate under foreign laws and with uncertainty over there too, and that invited mischief. And in fact, Americans went ahead and the internet knows no boundaries, and so people invested in things, including FTX, for example. And I use that as an example of how things should not be done. So Sam Bankman-Fried took his company and went to Nassau in the Bahamas and had his fingers in the till and whatever else, and lied to investors and to customers. But he invested in one company called LedgerX, which is a swaps trading platform for digital assets. And so it was organized originally and continues to this day under the Commodity Exchange Act rules that the CFTC promulgates. And it was examined by the National Futures Association. It had segregated accounts, and so kind of like when others have failed in the past. When you had FTX implode, LedgerX didn't skip a beat. It was sold out of the bankruptcy estate to, it's either MyX or MyMex, I'm not sure which it is. And so it still functions to today. And so luckily for the investors in FTX, it returned money to the corpus to be distributed. So that is a great example of fit-for-purpose regulation. You had the CFTC, which was not like the SEC. It didn't chase, in general, the crypto industry away, and it embraced it and allowed for it to develop under those rules. And so it was the SEC that didn't collaborate with the CFTC. Kept on viewing cryptocurrencies as securities, and so we've changed that. We came out with an interpretative release here a couple months ago that we collaborated with on the CFTC. They joined us in it, and that's kind of shocking too to a lot of people because the two agencies have been at loggerheads for decades. And so anyway, so we basically, I've reminded you about the Treaty of Tordesillas, where the Pope divided the world between Spain and Portugal back in 14-something maybe it was, after Columbus. And so anyway, so we've done the same thing. The CFTC has jurisdiction over digital commodities and collectibles and tools. We have jurisdiction over tokenized securities. And I'm happy to say Jonathan Gould, the controller of the currency, has jurisdiction over stablecoins. So the world's divided. Maybe I should change that, like Gaul, divided into 3 parts. But anyway, we've tried to deliver some kind of clarity to it.
Paul, I contend that it's impossible to appreciate what you're doing without at least glancing back to the regime that was in place up to a couple of years ago. Define regulation by enforcement and tell us why you so despised it.
Yeah. Well, so regulation by enforcement is the example there of, just come in and fill our S1 out. It's very easy to do, or come in and talk to us, and then you find a closed door, or like I heard people over time say that, you come in and talk to the SEC, and when you get home, you find a subpoena on your doorstep. So anyway, so that's regulation through enforcement, where the SEC doesn't take the initiative to adapt itself to a new reality, and it keeps its old tradition and just says, fine, you figure it out. You have lawyers too, as well as we, and so you just go to it. Well, that's the wrong approach, especially if you have a hammer that you can then go hit somebody over the head with. So I think that you need to embrace the innovation, embrace the people who are trying to follow the rules, and to then adapt the rules so that it makes sense and that it accommodates the new policy. To me, that's duh. I mean, not really rocket science.
Paul, again, I know you don't want to bash your predecessor. I do, however.
Okay.
So here's Gary Gensler in 2024. This is one of the, as I count it, correct me on this, but this administration, you largely, but also the acting director who preceded you, have withdrawn 14 major rules that were proposed by your predecessor. And the rule on disclosure for climate matters was one of them. Here's Gary Gensler in 2024. I'll read this and you tell me why it's mistaken. Already 90% of the Russell 1000 issuers are publicly providing climate-related information. Further, nearly 60% of those top 1,000 companies are publicly providing information about their greenhouse gas emissions. Investors ranging from individuals to large asset managers have indicated that they're making decisions in reliance on that information. It's in this context that we, the SEC, have a role to play. Close quote. Paul?
Well, I would respond. So we haven't, that rule is still in effect. It's in abeyance.
Oh, you haven't?
No, we have, because it was actually promulgated. Oh. So we can't just willy-nilly announce it's gone. So we are about to launch a rulemaking process to address it and to request comment on withdrawing it, and then proceeding under the Administrative Procedure Act. So anyway, so that will be coming out shortly. So I'd love comment, but again, so what that statement misses is the real essence of the Supreme Court's decision back in 1976. It's called TSE Industries versus Northway, and Thurgood Marshall wrote the opinion for the court. And basically it said that unlike that statement, which says, well, just because some people want to have that information means that, and the SEC concocted a new term called decision useful. We should require companies to give decision useful information to their investors. Well, that's wrong. That's not the law. The law is, under Thurgood Marshall's opinion, is that a reasonable investor, meaning an objective person, not you, not me, not BlackRock, not whoever out there as an investor, is it's not what any one of those people think, because like some people you may have an ulterior motive, like, I have some business reason to do that. And so you want that, but that doesn't mean a reasonable investor who wants to put money into something, who wants to make a good investment decision, whether to buy, sell, or hold, needs to know, whether or not whatever some of those things are, what kind of scope 3 or 2 or 1 type of score the company has. Now, maybe companies provide that because they want to, or they think that some of their investors like it and they want to accommodate their investors, but that doesn't mean that the United States government should compel someone to disclose that. That's not the law. And Thurgood Marshall, and I commend this to your reading, because it is the seminal decision that then goes through a whole bunch of cases thereafter that are important in the M&A context.
But that remains very much the controlling decision.
It does, and he said that if you depart from an objective standard, then it becomes very vague as to what should be to be required, and the possibility or the probability of then having an avalanche of information coming out that will do more to obscure than enlighten, is what has, I think, happened. Frankly,
what was that company with the 10K that was?
I like to cite Entergy, which is a public utility down in Louisiana and Arkansas. So they're not to pick on them, but I mean, that's not their doing necessarily. But I had a whole stack of the printout of it when I testified before Congress a couple months ago. 970 some pages is their 10K. Now, it's a complicated company, but still, you know, I really dare anyone in this room to read that and figure out what's going on. I see Paul Grayval here, but before I left my firm to take this job, one of my former colleagues, Kathy Casey, was a former commissioner of the SEC. So I was in her office and I saw this big stack of paper on her desk. It was the Coinbase 10K for whatever, maybe that was 2025. And I looked at it, and so I had to look and see it was like 280 some pages. And maybe this one section that I love to pick on, because mea culpa, I voted for this back in 2005, is called risk factors. I think your risk factors section is like 70 pages long. Unbelievable. And Coinbase is a complicated company too, with lots of risks. But when we voted for that particular thing, the idea of the then head of corporation finance, Alan Beller, was the first thing that investors should be able to open up when they open up the 10K is to see what keeps management up at night. You know, we figured a couple pages of bullet points or something. Now, on average, risk factors is the longest single section of the 10K because lawyers are risk averse and keep on putting everything in. And there's a doctrine that's grown up over time in securities lawsuits called the bespeaks caution doctrine, where if it's buried on page 942 of that Entergy thing in footnote 3, then, you know, there's an argument that you should have known what's disclosed. So Thurgood Marshall was exactly right that, you know, that too much information does more to obscure than to enlighten. And I was asked at that same hearing by a congressman, well, what about AI? Isn't that the answer to all this? Well, yeah, maybe if it doesn't hallucinate. But, you know, the trouble is that someone has to pay for all that stuff to be produced, to be gone over, to make sure there's no mistake in it and everything else. So that's a lot of lawyer, accountant, and company time and distraction and cost. And so that's something we have to remember. None of this is free. It's not just, I wish I had $1 for every time I've heard, oh, it's just disclosure. We can add another rule to the bucket, but it's not. It really makes a difference, and ultimately that straw breaks the camel's back.
Paul, last question. I see from a man managing this evening that we're out tight on time here, so here's the last question. You mentioned that your former firm, you built a firm in Washington. You have achieved a major reputation as an expert in securities litigation, and here you are going.
Law, maybe not litigation.
Beg your pardon. Securities law. Forgive me. The securities bar. The securities bar has for a long time known and respected the name Paul Atkins, and here you are going back into the federal government, and the amount of income that you are foregoing brings tears to my eyes, let alone to the eyes of your lovely wife, Sarah.
Right.
Why are you doing this?
Oh, I see. Well, I think, I didn't campaign for this job. Obviously, I was, approached and asked to do it. I think we're at an incomparable time to really make a difference. And when you look at what's gone on in the past few years, the opportunity to change it, to get things back in a direction where, we are attracting investment in the United States. We are encouraging entrepreneurs. We are trying to make our public markets better again. We are trying to, keep things, focused on investors, because I mean, there are people who lie, cheat, and steal. Shock. Why did whoever the bank robber, when he was asked, why did you rob the bank rather than something else? Well, the money's at the bank. Well, so the same thing in the stock markets and or in capital markets overall. So we just, we have to keep our eye on the ball and not go off on frolics and detours. And there are others. Regulation through enforcement, and where a kind of ticky-tack type of enforcement actions where there was no investor harm, but it might have been a books and records, like the whole texting thing where the SEC went on. It's like I don't know how many actions were brought and how many billions of dollars were taken in fines, and not one case of investor harm was identified. Well, why was the SEC distracted when there are, every day, just like there are muggings on the streets, there are people being ripped off, and the states can't do it, and a lot of this stuff, they can't do it alone. A lot of this stuff is, the SEC needs to be there as a cop on the beat. So that's just one aspect of it. But then to allow the whole apparatus to atrophy with some of the things that I just cited here earlier, I mean, these are reforms that could have and should have been done years ago. So we can do them now. We can get them adopted. And if they take root, it'll be harder for them to be washed away in the future, I think. So anyway, I think we can lead by example, show how things can be done, make things better for the country overall, and not to take anything from the private markets, but the two in sync, I think, is the answer, and that's what's created such a great economy and markets that we have here.
Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the SEC.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.